I just want to begin with reading you a little poem about baseball. It's a poem about how on one hand you could be living an ordinary middle-class life, and on the other some other stranger fate. Your fate as a poet, your vocation as a poet is already brewing for you. So the poet at 7. He could be any 7-year-old on the lawn, holding a baseball in his hand, ready to throw. He has the middle-class innocence of an American, except for his blunt features and dark skin that mark him as a Palestinian or a Jew, his forehead furrowed like a question, his concentration camp eyes, nervous, grim, and too intense. He has the typical blood of the exile, the refugee, the victim. Look at him looking at the catcher for a sign, so violent and competitive, so unexceptional, except for an ancestral lamentation, a shadowy, grief-stricken need for freedom, laboring to express itself through him. This is called Wild Gratitude. It's a poem in which my cat Zoe achieves literary immortality and fame by her association with a great cat out of literature, Christopher Smart's cat, Jeffrey. If you know this really fantastic poem by Smart, Jubilate Agno, he praises Jeffrey for many things. And in my poem, there are several quotes from Jubilate Agno. He calls Jeffrey the servant of the living God, daily and duly serving him. He praises the Postmaster General and all conveyancers of letters. And he calls the mouse a creature of great personal valor. Wild Gratitude. Tonight when I knelt down next to our cat Zoe and put my fingers into her clean cat's mouth and rubbed her swollen belly that will never know kittens and watched her wriggle onto her side, pawing the air, and listened to her solemn little squeals of delight, I was thinking about the poet Christopher Smart, who wanted to kneel down and pray without ceasing in every one of the splintered London streets, and was locked away in the madhouse at St. Luke's with his sad religious mania and his wild gratitude and his grave love for the other lunatics and his great love for his speckled cat, Jeffrey. All day today, August 13th, 1983, I remembered how Christopher Smart blessed this same day in August, 1759, for its calm bravery and ordinary good conscience. This was the day that he blessed the Postmaster General and all conveyancers of letters for their warm humanity, and the gardeners for their private benevolence and intricate knowledge of the language of flowers, and the milkmen for their universal human kindness. This morning I understood that he loved to hear, as I have heard, the soft clink of milk bottles on the rickety stairs in the early morning, and how terrible it must have seemed when even this small pleasure was denied him. But it wasn't until tonight, when I knelt down and slipped my hand into Zoe's waggling mouth, that I remembered how he'd called Jeffrey the servant of the living God, duly and daily serving him, and for the first time understood what it meant. Because it wasn't until I saw my own cat whine and roll over on her fluffy back that I realized how gratefully he'd watched Jeffrey fetch and carry his wooden cork across the grass in the wet garden, patiently jumping over a high stick, calmly sharpening his claws on the woodpile, rubbing his nose against the nose of another cat, stretching or slowly stalking his traditional enemy, the mouse, a rodent, a creature of great personal valor, and then dailing so much that his enemy escaped. And only then did I understand it is Jeffrey and every creature like him who can teach us how to praise, purring in their own language, wreathing themselves in the living fire. I want to read you two poems from a group of poems called the Desire Manuscripts. In every one of these poems, a lover addresses the beloved through the scrim of a classic text. You'll see what it is. This is called The Sentence, and it goes through the Inferno, Canto 5, which is the Paola and Francesca canto where the lovers are doomed to spend eternity swirling in each other's presence. Sentence. When you read Canto 5 aloud last night, in your naked sing-song, fractured Italian, my sweet compulsion, my carnal appetite. I suspected we shall never be forgiven for devouring each other body and soul. And someday Minos, a connoisseur of sin, will snarl himself twice around his tail to sentence us to life in perpetual motion, funneling us downward to the second circle where we will never sleep or rest again in turbulent air like other ill-begotten lovers who embraced passion beyond reason. And yet I cannot turn from you, my wanton. Our heaven will always be our hell, a swoon. And this is called After All the Orphic Enchantments through Metamorphosis, books 10 and 11, where Ovid so brilliantly tells the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. After all the Orphic enchantments, after all was said and done, after a second death stunned and claimed his wife for the fluttering clouds and phantom forms, the misting lower depths, after he pleaded with Charon for a second chance, but was dismissed and chased above ground, where he shunned women for a good 3 years and notched a life for himself with young men, a vegetarian priest who recited the passions of lovers who paid for their transgressions, the Cerastes, Therpiatides, Pygmalion, Myrrha and Cinyras, Venus and Adonis, after everything was closed, completed, and the costs were tallied, after he sang for the hyacinths and virgin laurels and charmed the drooling souls of beasts, after he enraged the Thracian women who circled like birds of prey and ripped him into pieces as the gods had prophesied, after his body watered the ground with blood and currents carried his severed head, chanting downstream with such a spellbinding grief that trees shed leafy crowns and stones leapt up and swollen rivers wept in their beds, I wonder if Orpheus ever decided it was worth it after all, relinquishing his body so he could return to the netherworld, which he knew by heart, and where, I hope, he moves with Eurydice on the other side, the shades still singing amid the other shades, sometimes walking behind her, sometimes ahead, and swiveling round to gaze at her forever. Two poems about my father. This is called Lay Back the Darkness. My father in the night, shuffling from room to room on an obscure mission through the hallway. Help me, spirits, to penetrate his dream and ease his restless passage. Lay back the darkness for a salesman who could charm everything but the shadows. An immigrant who stands on the threshold of a vast night without his walker or his cane and cannot remember what he meant to say, though his right arm is raised as if in prophecy, while his left shakes uselessly in warning. My father in the night, shuffling from room to room, is no longer a father or a husband or a son, but a boy standing on the edge of a forest, listening to the distant cry of wolves, to wild dogs, to primitive wing beats shuddering in the treetops. Here my father's the speaker. It's called My Father's Childhood. There's a story I tell in the poem, but given our recent adventures in war, I want to say something about it because the humanity of it strikes me. My father was born and grew up in Germany, and his father fought for the Germans in World War I. And he was wounded early in the war, and so they moved to a small village. And my father's father, my grandfather, had a job of guarding French prisoners in this small village. And every day he walked the villagers through town. But then they would take a right turn, and he'd go into their apartment with my grandmother, and they'd have tea together. And then they'd stop having tea, he'd go back out, he'd march them back to prison camp. So my father's speaking my father's childhood. I used to bring the conductor his lunch pail on the trolley that circled Mannheim. But I can't recall now if he was my father or my father's brother who moved to California. Maybe if he showed me his wounds. Papa guarded French prisoners in the village where we moved after he was shot down. He had trouble breathing after the war. Sometimes he marched them by our house and sneaked them in for tea. My mother made him keep his rifle in the hall. Otto, she said, and he put his gun away. Selma came from Hirsch on the Moselle. My brother Hans had curly red hair that looked like a burning bush, but I was the one who stuttered. The prisoners sang sad French songs and gave us pieces of chewing gum because they missed their families. I always liked those men who lost everything. My father had a premonition about the Nazis, and he followed his cousins to Chicago. He was a spotter who never liked working in the dry cleaners. We lived in an Italian neighborhood, and I had to fight every day on the way home from school. I didn't know English at first, and we were refugees with something to prove. Sometimes I crawled out my bedroom window to keep the fight going. I'd say God was a bully. You know, I can't call up one single word of German, the bastards, or the name of that village. But I remember looking out a window and seeing my mother standing in a garden. This was before the expulsion. I wonder if she ever liked cities. She was barefoot. Paradise lived under her feet. And then one final poem about my father in a group of poems called the Hades Sonnets. This is called the Forgetfulness Chair. My obstinate, self-absorbed, courageous father, shuffling across the living room floor to the determined chair in the far corner where my mother covered him with a blanket, and he promptly dozed off and woke up later without knowing where he'd awakened, was Perithous, slipping into the underworld through the open gate at Tynerum to abduct Persephone, the queen of death, while Hades, the unseen one, coaxed him into sitting down on the chair of Lethe, the stony black seat of forgetfulness, where he forgot why he had entered hell and never found his way back to the living. This is called Dates. After September 11th, everyone responded to this occasion in different ways. There was a tremendous amount of projection and I think oddity in addition to a kind of collective grief. And one of the things that I did, I was already on this path, but I went further, I suppose, is that I'd been doing a lot of reading to try and find my way back to the origins of Arab and Jewish culture, to the place where they come together and emerge from the same place. And so this poem, which is called Dates, is the result. There's a quote from the Hebrew Bible: "My love has moved to the mountains, and I'm sending her a palm branch." But in this poem, which my Aunt Lil gets associated with the great Sufi poet Ibn Arabi, my poem started because I was reading something that Ibn Arabi said that was so puzzling to me that I wanted to spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. I'll tell you what it is. It's a quote in the poem. He's talking about the date palm tree, and he says, it's so specific: "For us, therefore, the palm is like an ant on our father's side." So I just think that's totally weird. For us, therefore, the palm is like an ant on our father's side. So I spent a lot of time brooding about this weird thing the Sufi master had said, and so this poem is the result. Dates. I'm walking under the palm trees in Miami, buying a cluster of dates from an Arab vendor. I want to taste the sweet, sticky flavor of childhood again, its feathery leaves and secret pits. My Aunt Lil served dates to our family in ceramic bowls. She baked them into pastries. She said that the first taste of a date is like a child's finger in your mouth. The second is like the hushed sound of a father's evening prayer. The Sufi master Ibn Arabi believed that God created the palm tree from the surplus leaven of Adam's clay. Adam is the origin and archetype of all human bodies, and the palm then is his true sister. Adam had a sibling rooted to ground and branching in wind. For us, therefore, the palm is like an ant on our father's side. The date palm is as vertical as faith. Ibn Arabi compared it to a true believer and knows desire. The ancient rabbi spoke of a female palm outside Tiberias which withered on its own and only yielded fruit when pollinated by a male palm from Jericho. It thrives in valleys of lowland heat. My love has moved to the mountains, and I'm sending her a palm branch. There's a victory palm on Hasmonean coins, and Deborah judged her people in the shade of one as green and fulsome as the Messiah, a figure, I'm afraid, who does not arrive in time. The Romans engraved an image of the captive Judea capta, sitting in mourning beneath the palm tree. But I prefer the sturdy angelic palm I once saw carved on a stone frieze in a synagogue at Capernaum in Galilee. When my aunt was too weak to chew, my cousin mashed a date into puree and fed it to her with a tiny spoon, a last honeyed remnant of the garden. Ibn Arabi believed that God laid out an immense earth from one piece of leaven the size of a sesame seed. It was nearly too small to see, but it unfolded into a world of plains, mountains, deserts, valleys. The sixth Imam, Jafar Sadiq, explained that when God banished Adam, weeping from paradise and sheltering a naked wife, he ordered him to uproot the palm and expel it from the garden. And so Adam replanted it in Mecca. Thus is the bitter made sweet again. All other palms, east and west, descend from pits of those first Medina dates. My beloved dreamt of a palm tree buried inside her, and birds singing canticles of praise day and night. The bird's song vanished when she woke up, and soon she forgot the enchantment. All this happened years ago. But one night when she tasted a date, she felt a palm spreading its leaves somewhere inside her, and pure voices rising with wings. Did I say that the vendor sighed when he handed me the fleshy fruit? I wanted the cluster to last, but the sweetness dissolved in my mouth, which is perishable human clay, while I strolled under a canopy of trees. We live on this vast earth for such a short while that we must mourn and celebrate right now. A palm leaf is shaped like an open hand. The taste of dates is holy. Self-portrait is Hades and Persephone. Out of the nether regions of nightfall in a spectral valley, the house of Dis, out of the smoky river and black tunnel, I suddenly recognized myself as Hades, devouring the maidenhead, a fresh girl staring into the yellow eye of Narcissus, an amorous innocent, a wide-eyed pupil I also recognized as some part of myself, ravenous to experience hell, eager for dark knowledge of the body, the long night of the descending soul, the madness beneath the surface of day. And so I married myself to a cycle that was demonic, treacherous, immortal. The widening sky. I am so small walking on the beach at night under the widening sky. The wet sand quickens beneath my feet, and the waves thunder against the shore. I am moving away from the boardwalk with its colorful streamers of people and the hotels with their blinking lights. The wind sighs for hundreds of miles. I am disappearing so far into the dark, I have vanished from sight. I am a tiny seashell that has secretly drifted ashore and carries the sound of the ocean surging through its body. I am so small now, no one can see me. How can I be filled with such a vast love?